Hey, it's me again, Wasabi, and today's video is sponsored by me. Aside from reviews, there are a couple of things I would imagine a consumer would wonder about, especially when it comes to deciding between two mice but only having enough to spend on one. So I still buy products to find out for myself. Anyway, today we're looking at Lamzu's Atlantis line, and that's because they recently released the Atlantis Mini Champions Edition. The Atlantis Mini Pro, specifically this polar white colorway with the blue side buttons, base, and scroll wheel, is the one mouse that immediately comes to my mind when I think of Lamzu. I'd even say that it's the mouse that caught a lot of people's attention, making them realize that there are some really interesting options aside from brands like Logitech and Razer. So for quite a few people, this one is pretty memorable. Now when it comes to the Champions Edition, the one that we are comparing today, it's really not too different from the Atlantis Mini Pro, but if you're stuck between the two, this video should help. First, let's start with the basics, okay? So the Atlantis Mini Pro features a right-handed symmetrical shape, and it has an official weight of 51 grams and is priced at $91.99. On the other hand, we have the latest version, and this one's called Champions instead of Pro. You know, I feel like once a brand releases something with Pro in the name, anything that comes after, you really gotta be creative with the naming. But anyway, back on track, the Champions Edition has the same right-handed symmetrical shape, still weighs 51 grams, and comes in at a price of $99.99. First, we have the design, and there is zero difference in the shell and base design between the two, and the cutouts in the base for the skates are exactly the same. Oh, and these purple dot skates that you see, yeah, they're not included in the box, so just ignore them. The only difference I can pick out are the cutouts in the PCB of the Atlantis Mini Champions Edition are larger, probably to keep the weight as close to the original as possible. But aside from that, same. Nothing to report about the mouse button, side button, and scroll wheel wobble, because they feel pretty much identical in terms of how well they're fitted in. Build quality overall, everything feels exactly the same except for just one thing, and that is when I press on the base of the Atlantis Mini Pro right here. I'm getting some nasty creaking, but that's about it. And honestly, I can't imagine anyone intentionally pressing down on the mouse in that specific spot. So overall, I'd say they both feel just as good as each other. Coating, both mice feel pretty much the same in terms of coating. The Atlantis Mini Pro does look much sturdier than the other, but just ignore that because I've had this unit for a long time. I don't notice much of a difference between the two, at least not enough to make this a deciding factor. Maybe the Atlantis Mini Pro feels slightly chalkier, but not by much. I do, however, notice a slight difference in the evenness of the coating application. The Champions Edition looks more evenly applied and visually smoother under lights compared to the Atlantis Mini Pro. Other than that, nothing significant. For switches, the Atlantis Mini Pro uses Huano transparent blue shell pink dot switches, while the Atlantis Mini Champions Edition comes with Omron optical switches. And this is the biggest difference you'll feel between these mice. The Mini Pro clicks are way more tactile, crisp, and satisfying compared to the opticals on the Champions Edition. And that said, the optical switches don't feel all that bad. They're super light to press, have decent tactility, enough to feel like a real click instead of mush, and they're way quieter than the mechanical switches on the Mini Pro. Besides the standard advantages of optical switches, I still think the mechanical ones feel better, but honestly, the opticals still feel pretty good. They're both very different experiences and both feel great in their own way. Now for the side buttons on the Champions Edition, the side buttons feel just a little heavier and tighter, but that might just be because I've had my Atlantis Mini Pro for over a year now, so the buttons have naturally worn in. As for pre-travel and post-travel though, pretty much the same on both. Scroll wheel, there is a change in the scroll wheel encoder. The Atlantis Mini Pro uses TTC silvers, while the Champions Edition has what they call Lamzu encoder. Probably just a rebranded and custom tuned encoder, but when comparing the feel, the Champions Edition does feel a bit more refined. It's quieter to scroll and the clicks are quieter too. Could be because my Mini Pro is well worn in, but other than that, it's not a deal-breaking difference. No difference in the weight, both are listed to be 51 grams. Tech differences on the other hand, there are some here. On the Atlantis Mini Pro, you got a port 3395 sensor with a battery life of 100 hours. On the other hand, the Champions Edition, you get a port 3950 sensor with the option to set your liftoff distance as low as 0.7 millimeters, while the lowest setting you can go to on the Mini Pro is 1 millimeter. And from the Atlantis Mini Champions Edition, you get a battery life of 80 hours. Both mice have a maximum polling rate of 1000 Hz out of the box. If you want a higher polling rate, you will need to buy a high polling rate receiver separately. I don't have the 8K polling rate receiver, but according to their website, only the Atlantis Mini Champions Champions Edition and the Maya Doodle are supported. Now both of these mice use the same Nordic 52840 MCU, at least that's what is listed on the packaging. They also both require software that you have to download from Lamzu's website, which is a bit of a shame since the Champions Edition was released around the same time as the Maya X, which had Lamzu's first web-based software. That software was actually pretty good, so it would have been nice to have it for this one. And when it comes to the shape, it's the exact same thing. There are no differences here. Alright, so recommendations. The price difference between the two base models without high polling rate receivers is just $8. And even the packaging is exactly the same. They pretty much swapped out the image and updated the numbers on the box. Now for those of you who are looking to get an Atlantis Mini for the first time, the main question you gotta ask yourself is, are you fine with using optical switches? And I bring this up because I know some people would pick mechanical switches over opticals no matter what. So if you're okay with opticals, just go with the Champions Edition if you are interested in buying an Atlantis Mini, because it's basically an Atlantis Mini Pro with a port 3950 sensor and optical switches. The original Mini Pro came out when Lamzu was not as well known as it is today, and quality control issues were more common back then, and I'd imagine that it's much improved now, or at least I hope so. Maybe they made silent updates to later batches of the Mini Pro, but if you're buying from a local distributor, who knows, they could still have an older batch sitting in their inventory. So if that is something you're concerned about, the safest option is to just get the Atlantis Mini Champions Edition. Now for current Atlantis Mini Pro owners, is the Champions Edition worth upgrading to? Honestly, that is tough to say because looking at Lamzu's mouse releases, it feels like the Atlantis Mini is due for a new version. If you already own a Mini Pro, I'd only recommend getting the Champions Edition if your current mouse is having problems and you are 100% sure that this is the perfect shape for you. If not, I'd say just wait for them to release a new one or try something different, because you might just end up finding something that fits your hand and playstyle even better. If I had to pick one, I'd go for the Champions Edition, but honestly, if that wasn't the case, I wouldn't buy either, because it feels very likely that a new one is just around the corner. I mean, I could be completely wrong, but what I do know is that as much as I enjoyed my time using the Mini Pro, after using other mice with somewhat similar shapes, I realized that I prefer others. The Atlantis shape gives you excellent control and a very locked-in feel thanks to the steep angles on the sides, but it's not very comfortable for all-day use. Back then, we didn't have as many options as we do today. The Atlantis line was Lamzu's most iconic release, and I'd say it's what really got the ball rolling for them. Then came the Lamzu Thorn, which was an awesome release, and more recently the Maya X, which really put them on the map. So I was honestly surprised to see them release the Champions Edition this late. First they launched the pink one, and more recently this panda white colorway. And to me, the Champions Edition feels like a filler release and a way to make the most out of the existing mold for this mouse. Because if you really look at it, it's the same mouse. The biggest difference I can feel is just the clicks from the optical switches. You know, this launch really reminds me of when Ninjutsu had the Sora, then released the Sora 4K, and not too long after they dropped the Sora V2, which came out to be a fantastic update that a lot of people loved. And honestly, I really hope Lamzu pulls off something similar with the next iteration of the Atlantis Mini design. No shade on Lamzu though, there's something for everyone, and after the huge success of the Maya X, I have no doubt that whatever they release next, a lot of people will be paying attention. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to support the channel, and I guess I'll see you in the next one.